And now we jump back into part 2, where Dan Olson is about to attempt to summarize the plot of Final Fantasy IX. Hope you enjoy.
All right, I'll take a crack at it. I watched a playthrough of it recently, so it's kind of fresh. All right, so
Okay.
you have a kingdom ruled by a queen, and she's got a daughter. She's got a rebellious daughter, and then a troupe of traveling actors comes in to kidnap her because they've been hired to kidnap the princess. And they show up to capture the princess, and the princess is like, oh, hey, good news. I'm actually trying to escape, so if you could kidnap me, that would be great. I'm looking to get out of here. And they do that, and they narrowly escape, and some bad things happen to some side characters, and eventually you make it to a neighboring kingdom where the princess's uncle is the ruler. And he's like, hey, I'm the one who hired these guys to kidnap you because I'm trying to get you out of there, but I couldn't overplay my hand because I'm pretty sure your mom is like completely bug nuts these days, and I didn't want to risk starting a war. And while they're busy having this discussion, the queen actually goes to war with a third kingdom
Of rat people.
And they're like, oh crap, what's going on with this? So the party all takes off. Oh, by the way, Garnet's uncle, Princess Garnet's spoiler. Princess Garnet's uncle has been transformed into a giant sapient cockroach.
Yep. Oh, and we should mention, it should be pretty obvious, where this is episode 57 of the Best Games period. You should know. We spoil everything.
Yeah.
Don't worry about... Why are you listening to a podcast that goes in depth?
17-year-old game.
So, yeah, go forth. Spoil away.
So they head to the Rat Kingdom in order to... Rat Kingdom of Burmecia to try to head off the army, and when they get there... This is the end of Disc 1. They finally run into... And this gives you an idea of how slow a burn this plot is at the end of Disc 1, you run into Kuja, who is actually the big bad boss of most of the game. Sort of.
He's a gigantic bass.
Sort of. There are plot twists a-coming. And so that's the end of Disc 1. Disc 2, the party all kind of splits up in the chaos because they actually get their ass kicked by Kuja. And the party splits up in the chaos because the noble knight is trying to get the princess back home, and she thinks she's headed back to her uncle. And
well, it actually did. It split up. It split up before that.
It did
right?
split up before that. Right.
Yeah.
Before, because they all make the decision to head to help Burmecia, and she makes the decision to actually try to re-escape.
Well, she's going back to her home castle to try and convince her mother to stop the war.
Yes, she wants to try to talk mom out of going to... she wants to talk mom into standing down. And this is where I'm gonna start screwing up like the order of the order of events. But there's chaos, and it turns out that Kuja is actually working for a malevolent demigod named
Garland.
And the queen had basically hired Kuja and Garland to build her an army so that she could take over the world, but really Garland has been manipulating her into going crazy so that she's going to become a warmonger so that he can sell her an army.
Well, so I don't think Garland had any... So this is I guess this is where you're kind of talking about the nonsense part, because it does get kind of convoluted.
Yeah, because we haven't even talked about the Black Mages yet, and the Black Mages are an element that is planted in Disc 1 but then like
Yes.
slowly paid off over time as you learn that the black mages are the like construct army that the queen had made, but she had them made because she was basically mind controlled and told to make an army. It's in a lot of ways, it's actually the plot of the Star Wars prequels. So she gets sold this army that she was told to requisition.
Question. I do have a question though. I wasn't sure about this. I don't know if she's actually being mind controlled.
Or, well, I don't know. They constantly... So the thing is that Sid is constantly mentioning, like, something has changed about her, and it's unclear...
Yeah.
It is left somewhat unclear if that's just her not coping with her husband's death very well, or if Garland kind of orchestrated her husband's death as a means of, like, gaining control.
I don't think
Garland or if Kuja was doing it
anything
independently as a like actor under Garland, that it's like Garland is like, go forth and cause chaos by my child, and Kuja's like, hey, I'm gonna play Rasputin over here.
I think that's more what happened, because Garland isn't even introduced into the game until I think well past the midpoint of Disc 3. And
Garland first shows up. I can't tell. I don't remember where this is in the disc order, but Garland first kind of shows up, and then there's a callback to this later when the Queen tries to use Alexander because she thinks Kuja is under her, like that Kuja's loyal to her, but he's not, and so yeah, there's
the Queen summons Bahamut.
The Queen summons Bahamut.
And to kill Kuja, and Kuja uses the battleship Invincible, summons that to confuse Bahamut.
And then Alexander showed? Wow.
So Alexander's later.
Later.
Yeah, so here's what I got out of this.
Okay.
Garland, who's like the guy behind Kuja, set Kuja free on Gaia, which is the name of their planet, in order to cause chaos and just be a super powerful, crazy person and sow dissent in the world. And
for
Kuja
reasons that we'll come to later.
Yeah, and Kuja is crazy, so he's fine with that. What I think happened was Kuja was basically just approached the Queen of Alexandria and was like, hey, I will give you an army with which you can take over the world. And it seems like she was a relatively okay person in the past, at least at some point. But Kuja managed to kind of stoke her greed and desire for more.
Sid, I remember this. Sid mentions that it's been about 6 months, that it's been like the last 6 months her disposition has changed.
Yeah, something along those lines. And they're already mass producing this black mage army. And so then we find out that there are these beings called Eidolons. Eidolons. And the Queen is basically going after those. And she uses one to destroy the secondary city of Bermesia, Clara? Something like that. And then we find out that Garnet, or Dagger, whichever, Princess Garnet, actually houses a bunch of these Eidolons, and they're all being extracted from her for use in this war. After she's drained, the heroes kind of show up at Alexandria to rescue her, because she's one of them now. This is getting to be a long synopsis. I'm going to try and shorten it up a little bit.
There's a showdown, and the Queen dies. Like we'll shorten it to that. There's a big showdown between like 3 different sides, and the Queen dies.
After she manages to conquer the entire continent, wants the rest of the world, basically blows herself up for her greed.
Yeah.
Garnet comes back to the capital to start trying to rebuild her nation after restoring the other ones. And she's queen, but she hasn't had her ceremony yet. She's getting ready for the ceremony. Then Kuja attacks with his own army, and that's when Alexander is summoned.
Right.
And at that point, that's when Garland is basically like, well, nah, not going to help you, right?
Yeah, more or less.
Okay. Do you want to take another crack at this?
Well, then, okay, so then there's a lot of kind of very ordinary sort of running around to be like, what's going on? Who's in charge of what? And there's a bunch of little micro plot details until it comes back to the macro plot, which is the Aoife tree and the summoners. And so you meet another summoner, and you learn that Garnet was actually like not kidnapped as a baby, but she was like as a kid. She was like shipwrecked, and she kind of has like flashback memories to this throughout the earlier part of the game. And there's also a reference to the fact that she had a horn, and then they come across this little girl who's got a horn on her head, and she can summon eidolons, and it's like, what's going on? And then all of her memories come back, and she remembers that she was actually from this civilization out in the desert that got destroyed by a giant eye in the sky, which is Garland. And that she and her family managed to escape, but the boat that they were on capsized, and then she was found as, she was like 5 at the time. And so she was found, and she was raised in the royal family as the daughter of the queen.
But there was a real Princess Garnet. She died.
Yeah.
And they found Garnet, and she did have a horn, and they had it removed. And so, yes, she can summon things similar to Eiko, however you want to pronounce it.
I do want to say there is a lot, like, if you read into what information Final Fantasy IX presents you on these characters and situations, there is a lot of really, really messed up things going on. And in this particular instance, they adopted Garnet as the princess, because she happened to look exactly the same as their daughter who died, except she had a horn.
Yeah.
And that's so weird. That's so weird.
Kind of really messed up. So then the Aoife tree, they find, there's also all of this mist that like covers the world, and they use it sort of as a power source, and then they find out that all the mist is coming from the Aoife tree, because the big like plot reveal is that Garland is using the Aoife tree to recycle the souls of the dead into mist, and then he's using that mist to power his machines like the Black Mages.
Yeah. There's a really interesting cosmology going on in Final Fantasy IX, where each planet essentially has a set number of souls that get reincarnated, and the Aoife tree disrupts that cycle by turning the souls into this mist, and that's where like all the monsters are coming from, and the Black Mages, and what they're powering their machines on. So they're literally powering everything with dead people. Yeah, ghosts. And his plan is to replace all of the living souls with souls from his dying/dead world.
Yeah.
The general plot is actually kind of similar to, and I hate to say it, but it's kind of similar to Man of Steel.
In a broad stroke.
In a broad stroke,
like
his general
Garland plans on turning Gaia into a replacement Terra, because Terra is dead, and then you fight the embodiment of entropy, and the game ends.
Yeah, that's pretty much it. After the big reveal that your main protagonist hero man is actually
an alien
clone.
An alien clone powered by souls stolen from Gaia. And also his best buddy is a robot also powered by stolen souls.
Yeah. I will give credit to Final Fantasy IX for not giving Vivi like this really cliched story like he woke up on a battlefield or something like that. Like,
yeah, no, he just kind of wanders into town one day with only a hazy memory of how he got there.
with a counterfeit ticket for a play.
Yeah.
I really want to know what happened before this.
Well, and the great thing, so like you find out that Vivi's actually like he's the prototype of the combat mages. So he's essentially just like the proof of concept that like yeah, we can totally do this whole thing where we like cram like other people, where we cram minced soul into a robot and set it loose on the world. Like yeah, it works. He's not that durable. He's got an awful lot of free will, but, you know, it works. What are we going to do about him, boss? I don't know. Give him a ticket. Send him to a show.
Send him to that weird, long-tongued,
there's a party.
genderless thing.
Yeah, there's a party back in the Capitol. Send him there. He'll enjoy it.
But don't give him a real ticket.
He'll learn to play cards.
Also, I was really surprised, but the poverty-stricken rat child who lives on the streets of this city ends up being later the Prince of Burmecia.
Yeah.
And it's never really explained
it's
what
basically
he's
just
doing.
a like Prince and Pauper reference, I think, is essentially all
But-
what they're doing there.
But his dad is like, please come home. And the prince is just like, nah,
Okay, yeah.
runs off into be...
I want to live with the real people.
I'm pretty sure that's where the entire plot of Dishonored came from. So, if you really want to know more about that, just play that game.
Yeah. So the final couple beats of the game are that the party has a couple different showdowns with Kuja, and they sort of half manage to sway him to realizing that Garland is really doomed for everyone's world, and that this plan is awful and immoral and like deeply evil, and like maybe you shouldn't do it. And he's like, I don't know. I kind of really like being evil. And they're like, well...
No. Garland, who has been killed at this point, he's been kicked off into a bottomless pit, I assume. Basically, voice from the grave tells Kuja, oh, by the way, you're mortal. You're going to die eventually. And Kuja loses it.
Joke's on you.
Kuja loses it and destroys all of Terra.
Yeah.
And then the party escapes, and they're, you know, on this brand spanking new battleship, and they're like, well, what do we do now? And one of them's just like, what if Kuja's not dead? They're like, well, he's probably coming to destroy our planet now. And like, they're like, oh, well, better get ready for that then.
So the final couple story beats are that there's a big showdown at the Aoife tree. The Aoife tree starts turning to stone, and Zidane jumps off the ship to save Kuja, and gets trapped inside the petrifying Aoife tree. Fade to black, and then it's like 5 years later, something like that.
I don't think it's ever specific, but it's very clear that it's a lot of time.
It's been quite a while, because
it's been long enough for Vivi to have children.
Yeah, so then the denouement is told in a letter, in the form of a letter that Vivi wrote to Zidane, basically being like, hey, in case you show up again, this is what everybody's been up to, because, like, heart-wrenching spoiler, as it goes through all of these little vignettes of, like, you know, what's been happening in the meantime, like, okay, Steiner's now, like, captain of the guard, and, you know, he and Beatrix kind of got a thing going, and everybody's more or less happy, and, oh, by the way, because I'm just a robot, I don't have a very long period of life, so I'm writing you this letter because I'm going to die soon.
Well, he was only supposed to live 1 year, so really he got quite a bit out of his life.
Yeah. So it's so that's kind of like the heart-wrenching thing, is that it's like all Vivi's little kids come in, and you realize that it has actually been long enough that like Vivi's gone. And then the final big moment is that the company, the actor company, the acting troupe comes back, because it's the same big festival that started the game, and there's a callback to this play that they perform called I Want to Be Your Canary, and I'm choking up a bit, but because so the main character in I Want to Be Your Canary is performing his big love soliloquy, and then he like whips off his coat, and it's Zidane, and Garnet like throws her crown to the ground and runs through the crowd, and they hug, and it's beautiful, and the music swells, and everybody cheers, and
there's this
you get a knot in your
moment.
throat, and you're just like, I wish Vivi were here.
It's a good tale.
I see what you did there. And there's a wonderful little moment in that end scene too, where she loses her pendant that she's had the entire game, and it falls on the ground, and she looks back at it, and then keeps going to Zidane anyway, because he's more valuable than that thing. Nice little. There's just a lot of little nice visual touches to Final Fantasy IX.
Yeah, I mean, in that moment is like, to kind of loop this back to like story and these personal stories, like her thing is letting go and self-acceptance. And so the garnet falling to the ground, the necklace falling to the ground, and her deciding to keep going is that, the symbolic realization of that sort of self-acceptance.
Okay, so I want to back up just a little bit to that ending.
Okay.
Because it's very... compared to the rest of the game, it's very bizarre. Because essentially what happens, there's the reveal that... Because every Final Fantasy game has to have a crystal.
Yeah.
And the crystal in Final Fantasy IX is essentially God. Like, it is the thing from which all life originates, I guess. And it keeps existence going. At least that's what I got out of the explanation of what the crystal is. It's like the essence of all memories. You have a final battle with Kuja there, and I'm a little bit hazy on what exactly happens immediately after that. Because it seems like, and I have two interpretations, and I don't know which one is right, but it seems like Kuja destroys the crystal with kind of his last-ditch, I want to kill everyone move.
Yeah, and this kind of goes back to what I was saying, and sort of like when we were talking about, it's like, what's your relationship with the game? Is that the events, particularly in the climax, are a little unclear. And another thing that you can probably already notice from the recap is that similar story beats kind of keep coming up again and again. That it's like, oh, they're at Alexandria, and then there's a big showdown, and then an Eidolon shows up, and it's like, so yeah, I agree. Like, it's a little unclear, like what exactly goes on, and I'm sure there's a wiki somewhere that explains this in excruciating detail.
But I think there might be a bit of method to that madness.
I would agree. I would agree that it's purposefully done, but it can make things a little hard to really grab on your first pass.
Final Fantasy IX is heavily symbolic. Like, there's a lot of symbolism going on, and I think basically that entire ending climax is just a symbolic battle between existence and non-existence and finding purpose in life. Like, it's this existential climax. And this battle for meaning and to shout into the void, I exist. And it's all told through this battle against the nothingness, the Necron.
Yeah.
Which, of course, there's always, like, 5 levels of bad guys, and the Necron is, I guess, the ultimate bad guy who just shows up at the end.
Yeah.
No explanation.
No explanation. You get to a save point, and then you talk to an NPC who's like, oh, by the way, the manifestation of entropy itself is is down that hallway. You should maybe go kill it. And you're like, what? Okay.
Well, and then no one talks about it after the fact either. It's just, well, that we beat Kuja, everyone. No one's going to talk about you literally fought, like, the embodiment of nothingness.
Yeah.
All right, whatever. Let's move on. You said there weren't really any high point moments for Final Fantasy IX.
I should say that there's not very many mimetic moments. Would be a better way of putting it.
Okay. Yeah, because Final Fantasy IX for me was a very enjoyable experience throughout the entire thing, and there are moments I definitely remember. Like, there's something really exciting about that intro.
Mm-hmm.
The entire introductory sequence is, for my money, some of the best Final Fantasy has done.
It's also a really strange thing. Like, it's very appropriate to the game that follows. Like, it does... I don't think it does a good job of, like, letting you know, like, hey, this is going to be a slow burn. But once you realize the game is a slow burn, then the intro is quite appropriate. Because the first hour of the game, like, not a whole lot happens. And the stuff that happens is really, really sort of low-key and localized. In a way that particularly Final Fantasy VII and Final Fantasy VIII, both of which kind of really tried to start off on like a huge bang. Whereas the first hour of Final Fantasy IX is you spend a decent chunk of it as Steiner just running around yelling at the rest of the guards because they're busy slacking off and not doing their jobs. And you spend an equally big chunk of time as Vivi just kind of like running around learning how to play cards and all of these other things. Like the systems and tone that they present with the early game is really personal in a way that doesn't necessarily come through on your first playthrough if you're not expecting it.
Yeah. Well, and it's also a little bit of a reversal of tropes going on as well. Like, instead of rescuing a princess from a castle, you are stealing a princess from a castle, except that kind of alteration to the trope is then further subverted by the fact that the princess actually is using you to escape from the castle.
Yes.
Herself. She's taking matters into her own hands. And it's just very convenient that you happen to show up. Which is strange to me how refreshing that is in a game that is 17 years old. Not only are each of the characters that we spend time with very fleshed out, but a lot of even the side characters get their moments. Like, each of the members of the Tantalus Company.
Yeah.
Like, very much have their own things going on. Like, they have their own desires, they have their own motivations and relationships with each other. It's very... it's weird. Was this based on a pre-existing property? Like, did they have, like, a short manga series going on beforehand or something?
I don't know if they had any tie-in stuff.
Because it feels like there's like a design document that goes more into detail about like a lot of the side stuff.
On that note, like, I do know that the design documents for the game are like intense and thorough. Like, I do know that much because, like, if you get the art book, The Art of Final Fantasy IX, like, it is. Yeah, there might as well have been a 10-season anime leading up to the game for like just the like sheer volume of material that's there.
I got a feeling like there was a design document along the lines of Fury Road where like each character had a full biography and history in this world.
Yeah, basically,
that
like
we weren't necessarily getting.
Like one of the main ones in the book is like Blank. You know, even though Blank spends like 2/3 of the game turned to stone,
frozen.
Like, you know, the relationships with the rest of the company and with Zidane like are all spelled out. Like, they had written that stuff as a reference for, you know, then when they're actually like writing the dialogue.
And even our main characters, there are a lot of question marks that the game just leaves unfleshed out, which I think is really interesting in that it kind of plays into how your imagination fills in the gaps anyway with games like this. So
there's so much that's fleshed out that the gaps become very intentional.
Yeah. Again, one of the things I found that was kind of pretty messed up. Zidane at one point in the game tells a story that's clearly about him, trying to figure out where he came from and all that stuff. And he talks about his adoptive father, who is the leader of the Tantalus Company, and fondly recalls how his father beat him.
Yeah.
And, like, that is a weird quirk, because it tells us a lot about Zidane without actually going into, well, I feel this way about this because this. Like, it just tells us a lot in that one revelation of their relationship to each other. And it's something that we saw previously in the game when he and the Tantalus leader, the boss, when they fought each other as he was leaving the company. And so this is the kind of game where there is a lot of what would maybe traditionally be considered filler stuff that is actually being used to just further reinforce the characters or expand on the player's perception or knowledge of them in new and interesting ways.
Mm-hmm. So, I kind of want to talk about the strategy guide.
Oh, okay. It's time to talk about the strategy guide.
I think it's time to talk about the strategy guide.
All right.
I know there was like no segue there, but I feel like it's time.
It sounds like we need a strategy guide for this segue.
We need a strategy guide to help us with this plot. Let's take a look at the Final Fantasy IX strategy guide. Oh, all it tells you to do is go to playonline.com.
Is that literally it?
So the Final Fantasy IX strategy guide was I want to say it was originally developed by Brady Games, like because Brady Games does like all of them. And did them all back in the day. So it was developed in the same style and format as the Final Fantasy VII and Final Fantasy VIII strategy guides. A big full color glossy tome that walked you through everything. Except in the specific case of Final Fantasy IX, they wanted to this is 2000. This is like dawn of Web 2.0. And so they wanted to tie in the game guide with their new online stuff.
Okay.
And so that online stuff was playonline.com, which was a competitor to GameFAQs. You know.
Oh,
that it was supposed to be like the official version, of GameFAQs. And so the strategy guide all throughout it, rather like not just having the occasional like nugget of, hey, you can see you can see like more in-depth pictures of this on playonline.com, or you can get more information on playonline.com. It was like literally every single paragraph was like, it would tease things. It would be like, hey, there's a secret door in this cave. To find out where it is, go to playonline.com. Here's like all of the weapons have different abilities associated with them. To find out what those are, go to playonline.com. So the actual like workable information in the strategy guide was basically none. Like all of the reasons that you would get a strategy guide, things like having ability grids in front of you, having treasure lists in front of you, XP, monster stats in front of you, maps.
And remember, this is 2000, so you don't have like a phone.
Like, so having this stuff right in front of you is the entire reason you would buy a strategy guide, and none of that actual information is there. The strategy guide is essentially only useful as a, like, general walkthrough of the game. And I do mean general, of like, okay, here's where you want to go next. The problem is that it's already a fairly linear game, so where to go next isn't ever that big a question, you know? So it is the least useful strategy guide I think that has ever been produced. and the thing is that, like I've already mentioned, that GameFAQs was around, so it wound up backfiring on them in just a huge way. Because instead of driving people to playonline.com, it soured them against the idea of ever going to that site. And so they instead just went to GameFAQs and looked all this stuff up for free. Sure, it was presented in like crappy, ASCII charts, but, the information was there.
Yeah. And you didn't have to pay through the nose to get it.
Yeah, it was so bad. There are parts where it did not actually include any of the information that you would want a strategy guide for. You'd get to a boss, and it'd be like, oh, in this next place, you're going to fight a boss. To find out what their stats are, go to playonline.com. And then, like, right below that, it would be like, after you defeat the boss, there's a couple chests hidden in this room. To find out where they are, go to playonline.com. Next paragraph down. After that, you'll enter this hallway. There's a secret door in this hallway. To find out where it is, go to playonline.com. At the end of this hallway, you'll fight a couple bomb enemies. To find their stats, go to playonline.com. So, like, a half a dozen times per page, it would be telling you to go to playonline.com. Like, almost every single paragraph ends with, to find out more, go to playonline.com.
This podcast brought to you by playonline.com.
That's incredible, actually.
Yeah.
Who looks at that and says, yeah, this is
acceptable.
A good plan.
This is a product worth putting out there. Like, it is bizarre. So the strategy guide for Final Fantasy IX is like a cultural artifact of geek ephemera as a result of being just that terrible.
The strategy guide market has really only now started to bounce back, because I think there's a rash of stuff along those lines, but that is by far the worst example of it.
It was the worst example, and it was like one of the highest profile examples. Because, like, I mean, the Final Fantasy strategy guides have always sold fairly well, both because they've intentionally put a lot more sort of production into them. Like, they make them look nicer, they put a lot of art throughout them, they make them into kind of a collector's edition. I mean, like, Final Fantasy X actually published theirs in like a hardback version. So they do kind of try to spin them that way. And because they are such like huge games with just huge amounts of like information in like optimization, like you've got massive charts of like weapons and where to find them and how to unlock your ultimate weapon and how to unlock your limit breaks and where to, all of the secrets and all of the hidden characters and how to defeat the like optional mega bosses. And there's so much stuff there that it really is the kind of game where it's like, hey, a strategy guide actually sounds like kind of a decent product, to have it all in one volume rather than scattered over like 30 different fan written FAQs. So the Final Fantasy strategy guides have always been kind of a premium in the strategy guide market, and to have like one of them be just like that terrible is impressive.
That took some doing.
Yeah.
So we talked a little bit about the beginning. Are there any moments that stand out to you, like aside from beginning and end of Final Fantasy IX?
The one other thing that kind of has always always sort of stuck with me is when you're first meeting Eiko, Eiko? Eiko?
Eiko?
Because you'd pronounce both of the vowels, so it'd be like Eiko.
Yeah.
When you're first sort of meeting her and just the like gradual process of Garnet realizing that, you know, she's standing in the place that her entire civilization used to live, and now it's just ruins and desert.
Yeah. That, again, another bit of just like what an existential moment.
Yeah. Actually, I mean, I guess there are a couple other ones that stand out to me. I mean, and they're similar kind of moments, like Vivi's moment where he realizes that he's an automaton, and Zidane's similar moment, which comes very late in the game, where he realizes that like he's a clone powered by, you know, souls robbed from what he sees as his home, like, because he's, as far as he knows, he's lived his entire life on Gaia, and then he's on Terra, and they're like, oh, hey, you came back, and he's like, what do you mean I came back? And they're like, oh, you're actually like a deep cover operative, like you're the Manchurian candidate, and you're actually a clone, because our species are dead, and so we've been cloning ourselves, but the clones don't have souls, so we've been stealing souls from Gaia to put them inside our clones so that our clones have free will. Welcome home.
Oh, yeah, a lot of this game is characters struggling with their purpose in life, and also with the reality of death. And it's like a very grim topic. And like one of the moments that really stood out to me as kind of like a standout moment of that is these black mages are created for war. And Vivi at first seems like he's the only one that has
a
true free will, a soul. And later on in the game, we discovered that there's actually a village full of later created black mages that have escaped and, you know, become self-aware and have formed their own little village on a different continent.
Yeah.
And there is a moment where you find out they have a graveyard.
Yeah.
And there are just two black mages standing there kind of looking at this graveyard where they have set up like gravestones for their friends that have like little black mage hats on them, and like they don't even they're just coming to terms with existing, and they don't know how to come to terms with the fact that they have a very short lifespan. Like they don't know what to do. And there's a conversation that stood out. I wrote it down. And it's, they don't even give each other names. They have numbers. So it's Black Mage number 56. And he's saying, we had so many things to learn. It was really scary at first, but we helped each other. Then one day, Mr. 36 stopped moving. He just stopped. Wouldn't move or say anything. My friend who knows lots of things told me that this was what death was, and we had to bury him. Mr. 36 is buried under the ground now, but I don't understand why. Oh my gosh.
It's so intense.
It's so sad.
Yeah.
But it's coming from these characters that look inviting.
They look like toys.
Yeah. And are often compared to toys.
Yeah.
And in fact, there's a very early scene in the game where Vivi comes across a bunch of toys that have been left on the street and is just looking at them and is like, am I just one of these?
Yeah. The very subtle horror of that story is that, you know, when the black mages die, They don't, they don't get ill. They don't waste away. They just stop moving.
Yeah. It's there's a lot of things in Final Fantasy IX that are just horribly sad if you think about them. And I can understand if some people just didn't stop to think about what was happening and just played through, got to the end, and were like, well, that was very unsatisfying.
Yeah. I mean, and it is worth restating that it's like, this is a long game. And so you've got a lot of these themes, and you're not necessarily expecting this intensity of themes. And if you're playing it, air quote, authentically, like as a kid, as a first timer, like you're looking at a 40-hour game. And so to have a lot of this stuff spread out over that long a period of time, and to be intercut with the more routine game aspects of a JRPG, where it's like, oh, now you spend the next like 2-3 hours just running across a field battling wargs and slimes, and that cadence can make it kind of like slip out of your memory, that it's like, the immediacy of those themes is often very heavily diluted in, and I would say this is a thing with games as a whole, but JRPGs in general, because they do tend to have very large interruptions between story beats. And so subtle story beats really do tend to get lost, which is why I think you see, so many JRPG, like the points that do stand out to people in JRPGs are the big, Death of Eris moments, because they are mimetic, they are easily encapsulated, they are easily shared. And, as opposed to Final Fantasy IX, where it's like, oh, it's a really great game where you spend 40 to 60 hours slowly experiencing existential dread with these 7 people.
Yeah. And you're right, but I think Final Fantasy IX does, at least from where I am, like as an adult playing this game, the game continually goes back to that theme.
It does, yeah.
Like, over and over and over again, and is consistent to it in a way that a lot of other games,
it's an incredibly
even JRPGs,
mature
aren't.
Game. Yeah, it's an incredibly mature game, and approaching it either as an adult, approaching it as someone who kind of already has an awareness of what it's about, or like coming back to it for a second time, it's much better for doing those things. But it does, I think it undeniably creates a harder to get into, like a less accessible game, and which is why I think a lot of people have kind of, which is why it hasn't quite grabbed on in the same way, and which is why I think we're seeing now, a decade and a half later, it's really getting reevaluated, especially with the modern interest in video games, specifically as a thematic narrative mechanism. Yeah. And so it's like, hey, let's go back and reevaluate. Here's a very story intense game. Let's go back and reevaluate it. And in that reevaluation, people are going like, hey, this was kind of actually like a forgotten classic in a lot of ways, and it's done a lot of things that even games in between haven't done. Like this kind of a slow burn. Like specifically, I think people shy away from it specifically because it does become pretty inaccessible in a lot of ways, even if the end product is superior for it.
We haven't really gotten into gameplay stuff, but I will, I do think that Final Fantasy IX is probably one of the most accessible JRPGs I've played. Outside of earlier things, like Final Fantasy VI was very accessible as well.
Yeah, I mean, gameplay wise, I think it's got one. If I get really nitpicky about it, I think it's got one little steep spike a little too early in the game, right after the Tantalus crashes. I think that immediate segment right after is a little too steep, given that you don't quite have enough tools as characters yet, and given the save game mechanics, that just like it can set you back like quite a bit, like 10, 15, 20 minutes of progress is very easy to lose. Unfortunately early in the game, but once you're kind of over that hump, like it does have a generally pretty gentle, forgiving difficulty curve. Not quite as forgiving as 10. I think they learned a lot from 9 that they then incorporated into 10 as in terms of like, all right, let's just make it even smoother for players who are just going to kind of like follow the path. But it is, I think it is really accessible. The mechanics, like the underlying character mechanics, are simple but have a lot of depth in that you can, if you want to invest time and energy into optimizing, you can, and you are then rewarded for that by being like a complete badass as a result. But if you don't do it,
you can get by.
You can get by. Like for the most part, you're going to find yourself doing a little bit more grinding, which was just to be expected of games at the time. Like, no, of course you're going to have to grind at some point. Why wouldn't you? It didn't have the sort of modern negative connotations. It didn't even have the name grind at the time.
I am curious to know if they rebalanced the PC version of Final Fantasy IX when they ported it over last year.
I don't know. That would be interesting to find out.
Because I did not have I had hardly any problems going through this game just straight. Like I didn't grind. The only time I ground was I got to Ibsen's castle, which is this upside down topsy-turvy castle in the middle of a desert. Anyway,
it's a place that actually like lures you into grinding, because it's like, oh, hey, these enemies aren't that hard, and they give you like a ton of gil and a ton of experience, and you're like, maybe I want to hang out here for a bit.
Exactly. And but I didn't see a game over screen. I think I saw one up until that point, and then I got to the part where your party splits up and goes on the mirror quest thing that I mentioned earlier in the show.
They might have. I mean, it would be a really easy thing to change. Like, just thinking about it from a game dev standpoint, all you would have to do is just bump the base stats of each of the characters by a few points, and then that sort of early hump would essentially disappear, but it wouldn't require rebalancing the entire game, because by the time you're, level 20, that bump is meaningless. Like, it's like, oh, everybody starts with an extra, 3 strength and dexterity, and by 20, that's meaningless. By 80, it might as well not even, who cares?
Well, so, and that's why I wonder, because I actually went and tried to find out if they had rebalanced, but none of the changes I saw had mentioned rebalancing. So
it would be the kind of thing that I think would end up being so subtle. Like, if they had, you would almost need to do them side by side to notice. I mean, and maybe the answer is that they didn't, and I'm just terrible. I mean, that's a possibility. I'm just gonna leave that one on the table. Sure, why not? Dan is awful at video games. My streaming audience can attest to that.
But if it hasn't been rebalanced, I have to say that it is one of the smoothest JRPG progression that I've ever experienced. Because I literally only ground for 2 hours at Ibsen's castle, and then continued on with the rest of the game. And was fine. So I'm not entirely sure if that is the original. I cannot overstate how hard it is to balance a game properly like that.
Over the sheer scope of sort of ground that the characters end up needing to cover, that the systems end up needing to cover between, level 1 and level 99. and
Yeah.
maintaining anything resembling a like coherent difficulty curve through 60 hours of 40 to 60 hours of gameplay it's a daunting challenge.
And they have a really, like you said, it's a system that rewards investment, but however much you want to invest in it is fine. And I really enjoyed the entire ability learning system and how you can learn different things with different items, but also each character has a vastly different moveset for the most part.
Yeah.
And like you have a guy who can just throw items at enemies and it's great. And you also have a spear wielding rat knight who can jump up into the sky. And you have a summoner, obviously, and you have another summoner, which is really the only main repeat. And there's just I don't know, it comes together into a very satisfying package that I quite enjoyed. And hand in hand with that progression, Final Fantasy IX shakes up what you would expect a turn-based RPG to be able to deliver to you, because it doesn't just content itself with having the battles be just straightforward. Like, pretty much any time you think something is getting a little bit stale in Final Fantasy IX, it switches things up either with, the party is split up and now you have these two different characters working together, or, you're fighting a boss and it will only attack 3 of your party members, but if those 3 die, then you lose the fight. Or, like, there are tons of different conditions and ways that it makes things different in combat.
And now that's a thing that I know can frustrate some people, though. Like, a lot of people I do know a lot of people like to approach RPGs, like team-based RPGs, with like, okay, they pick their core team, and it's like, these are the characters I like, and I want to use them for the rest of forever. And if you force me to use Kate Sith, I will shut the game off and never play it again. So it doesn't quite do it as much as 13, but 9 does actually force you into team comps a lot for the first 2 discs.
Well, and that actually came back to bite me, because the reason I needed to grind was because in the battle where you team up against the Earth Shrine Guardian, it forces Zidane to pair up with Quina. Quina?
Quinoa. Yes.
And
the coup.
And I did not use that person at all, so she was... was he, she...
They, he, she. So Kina is called he, she in the English translation, and they in the Japanese version. They are a non-gender specific character,
which is in itself super interesting. As representation goes, even if they are a strange long-tongued monster thing. I don't even know how you would describe a coup. They're very strange.
Yeah, Kina is kind of is in a lot of ways the Kate Sith of Final Fantasy IX. They are the blue mage by design, but they've also got a kind of odd move set and unpredictable damage, and they're also a really weird character. So a lot of people just kind of sideline Kina and end up in a few of the forced Kina segments where they're like, crap, Kina's 10 levels lower than everyone else, because Final Fantasy IX still predates the everyone in the party gets XP systems.
Because this game is such a slow burn, Kina will initially rub you the wrong way. At least they did for me. Like,
Yeah.
I was just like, what is this weird-looking creature doing in this traditional fantasy game? They have nothing to do with the plot. Like, the only reason they join you is because you go through their swamp, and they're like, hey, take me with you on a journey because I want to eat all the things in the world.
Kina's elder is like, Kina, you're really bad at feeding yourself. You're bad at catching frogs, and all you ever want to eat is dirty swamp frogs. You need to learn the culinary joys of the world. And all the two coup in the scene look at Zidane, and the elder's like, Take my failure youngling with you and show them the culinary joys of the world. And Zidane's just like, all right.
Well, and it's great because as the game progresses through all of this existential nightmare fuel of things you could be thinking about, you grow to appreciate Kina more because Kina has life figured out. Like, Kina's the only one who knows what they want.
Kina wants to eat frogs.
And that's it. That's all they want to do. And if they got to do that, life would be swell.
But at the same time, Kina has an arc. They have an arc. Kina learns, it's a really simple arc. Kina learns the culinary joys of the world, and that there are, not only are there other foods besides swamp frogs, there are like 8 billion ways to prepare swamp frogs. So, yeah.
Well, and they also learn, that love is the best seasoning.
Love is the best seasoning, and also gets married to Vivi, potentially.
Is that what happens?
You can get Kina and Vivi married, yeah.
What? Oh, I did not get that scene, but is that in the troll village?
Yeah.
The dwarf village?
Yeah.
Sorry?
Yeah.
They just look like trolls?
Yes, that is one of the possible outcomes of that scene.
There are so many things, little things like that I love in Final Fantasy IX. I know we've talked a lot about these little moments throughout this game, but I just want to mention at least one more. And it's a scene pretty early in the game where they survive a horrific crash, and it's Vivi, Zidane, and Dagger, aka Garnet. And Garnet wakes up. There is actually an Eidolon named Ramuh, and is like, hey, if you reconstruct this story, I will become your Eidolon. And she's like, okay. And now, as a player, you can just skip this part if you don't want to deal with it. Or you can do it, and then you get a summon, which is, I don't know, pretty worthwhile, I guess. You find all of these aspects of Ramuh, and then you have to reconstruct the story. And then once you reconstruct the story, you have an option of how Dagger interprets the story. And you can do it either way. It doesn't really matter.
There's no consequences.
Yeah.
It's only thematic.
Exactly. And Ramuh is like, that's great, I'm your Eidolon now. Dagger runs off. And Zidane is frustrated because, I'll quote, he says, why try to give meaning to what the main character of the story chose? And, like, that, to me, kind of encapsulates a lot of Final Fantasy IX.
Mm-hmm.
Because it's giving you all of these ways to interpret it, and all of these things that have meaning attached to them. And as a player, you can choose what you want to find in this game.
Yeah. Oh, and we haven't even touched on the themes of, like, performance yet. The idea of persona that stems through it.
Yeah,
because I mean that's tying into it, where they're saying it's like, okay, well, why assign meaning to the main character? Because you also have this running thing. We mentioned this earlier. This play, how to I want to be your canary, and characters this is, they're actors, they're performers. And I was actually thinking of this when you were talking about Zidane's little backstory, when he talks about how I can't remember his name, his foster dad, beat him. And it's sort of this moment of realizing that, up to this point, Zidane's always just kind of been like, hey, super happy-go-lucky, always, too blessed to be stressed. And at this moment, it's not just like he doesn't get it. He doesn't understand what happened to him. He does. And he's kind of mostly accepted it and moved on. But to a certain degree, his chipperness is performative. But he's okay with it being performative because he's sort of internalized this notion of well, no, you be what you want to see in the world, even if it's not strictly real. That even if you're miserable, if you want to be happy, you're never going to be happy if you don't allow yourself to be happy.
Yeah, and there's also the element to Zidane's performance in particular, where he's not necessarily putting it on for himself. He's doing it for the benefit of other people.
Yeah.
Zidane, from the start, is a relatively perceptive person who has a lot of compassion for others. He knows how other people are feeling, and you can see that in his relationship with Vivi, and how essentially he's trying to help Vivi come to terms with, what Vivi is, and being a construct. And as far as an arc goes, that comes back later in that how he tried to help Vivi. Vivi's own struggles helped him realize what his struggles were. But going back just real quick,
it also interlinks with Garnet's, the things that Garnet needs to learn, that Garnet kind of actually needs to learn, that it's in order to be a leader, in order to be a ruler, you might need to perform.
Right. So just going back real quick to why I tried to give meaning to what the main character of the story chose. I think that speaks to a lot of things that, at least back in 2000, what younger gamers weren't ready for, in that they wanted something that was upfront and dramatic. And creating meaning and assigning meaning to what the main character of the story chose ran contrary to how game narrative was delivered.
Yes.
In general.
Even to this day.
It runs anathema to what a lot of people expect from games, which is just tell it to me straight. What happened?
Give me a plot. I will, yeah.
I think that might be one of the reasons that generally Final Fantasy IX tends to be overlooked when people are looking at Final Fantasy games, because, we've been talking about this entire time, it tends to be more subtle and more what you make of it.
Yeah.
Sorry, and then you were talking about performative stuff, and I think that really comes through with Steiner's character. And Steiner is the knight that has been loyal to Alexandria for his entire life. He serves the queen faithfully. He's going to get Princess Garnet back home and keep her safe. And his whole arc is about performance, about performing his duties, about what it means to perform and serve. And he goes through his own little existential crisis where he's like, what if good service isn't necessarily always following your orders to the letter?
Yeah. What if you are a good servant of an evil ruler? And it's
right.
Yeah. That's his confrontation, as he discovers that the queen to which he has pledged undying loyalty, hey, she might not be on the up and up. There's so much to talk about.
There's a lot to unpack with, especially with that performative point. It's a central theme of the game. It opens with the performance, it closes with the performance. Even Amaranth,
yeah. Red-haired kid.
His whole shtick is being a tough guy and performing his toxic masculinity.
Yeah.
Essentially. He picks fights with everyone to show that he is the big strong guy. And the only time he stops to think about whether or not what he's doing might be healthy is when a stronger guy beats him in a fight or somehow outsmarts him and gets the better of him, which happens to be Zidane.
Mm-hmm.
And that, in turn, just creates... His entire arc is basically just trying to figure out, gee, why is that Zidane such a strong, nice guy?
You're strong, but you're also kind. How?
It's a very simple arc,
yeah.
But it's interesting to see, and it's not necessarily very common. It's not a common thing to make one of the big, strong, too cool for school guys the type who's questioning their own persona.
Mm-hmm.
And that goes back to what I was saying earlier, in that there are a lot of subtle ways that Final Fantasy IX subverts expectations. Mm-hmm. And, like, that's one of them. Like, that's not something you see often. Like you said, there's a lot we could talk about, but where do you come down on Final Fantasy IX?
I think so kind of what's my bottom line with Final Fantasy IX?
Yeah.
I think my bottom line with Final Fantasy IX is that it's really underappreciated, under-respected. I think it's gaining in that regard. I think people are coming to reevaluate it and see what is, great about it. But I think it's been a bit of a lost classic for a while now.
Okay. So would you say it deserves a spot in video game canon? Just like a yes?
Yeah.
No?
Yes,
okay.
Yes. I think it absolutely deserves a spot in video game canon, even if it's not even if it does have its flaws. I think it does so many interesting things and so many different things that it deserves to be analyzed and remembered.
And what about you, Jeremy?
All right. So I absolutely think that Final Fantasy IX is a best games period. In fact, I think it's the best Final Fantasy game ever made, to date, at least. And the way things are going, that's probably going to hold true for quite some time, it sounds like. I think that the story is fabulous. I think the characters are amazing, even the ones that don't get a whole lot of screen time. I think there's a reason it's the highest rated Metacritic Final Fantasy game. And I do think there is a reason why a lot of people don't talk about it much, and that probably is because it kind of came out in that time right before Final Fantasy X, which was revolutionary, being on a new console and all that. But for me, it's my favorite Final Fantasy game. It's very memorable. There's moments in that game from 10 years ago that I'll never forget, or whenever it was I first played it, 7 years ago. And I think that it definitely belongs in the video game canon, Hall of Fame, so to speak. It ages pretty well, even for what it is. I mean, it's still a fun game to play in 2017, being almost 20 years old. So, for my money, absolutely a best games period.
Yeah. So, for me, I think I have to say yes. Like, I loved playing this game. It was great. It was refreshing. And I like, we didn't really talk about this much, but its commitment to showing that there is humanity even in the worst of villains and treating those villains with decency is actually one of the most shocking things about this game to me, because the game goes out of its way to show how Kuja, he starts world wars, he does genocide, he does all these terrible, terrible things, and in the end, literally everyone tells Zidane, don't go back for Kuja, that's a terrible idea, he's a terrible person, let him die. And Zidane's just like, I know it's probably a stupid idea, and probably not coming back, but this is just one of those things I gotta do. I gotta make this choice, and it might be the wrong choice, but I'm gonna make it anyway because it's the decent thing to do, because he's essentially my brother.
Mm-hmm.
The game pretty clearly tells you that Kuja dies at the end, but Zidane doesn't let him die alone.
Yeah.
And even the evil queen has her moment with Garnet, with her daughter, at the end, and shows that she's not a monster. Like, there's some humanity there. And that's so rare in a lot of these JRPGs, because usually it ends up being a battle against someone who has delusions of godhood or something like that.
The enemy is revealed to be even more monstrous than you ever anticipated.
Right, and instead with Final Fantasy IX, what we see at the end is this metaphorical encounter where Kuja is essentially going through the entire realization that all of our characters have been having throughout the entire game. That they are mortal, and that what is this whole existence thing that we're doing anyway?
Mm-hmm.
And that's what he's rebelling against. He's rebelling against the fact that he's realized that he's going to die. And I don't know, there's just something very relatable about that. On just like a fundamental level, I think.
Mm-hmm.
You know, raging against the dying of the light. But I think it's beautiful on a narrative level. I think it has a lot of really great subtle moments and character building, and it cares a lot about these characters and makes you care about them too, which really is the most, like, that's the most impressive part, that it manages to pull it off. So yeah, I'd say it is. Well, thank you, Dan O, for coming on the show, Dan Olson. Where can people find you online and see some of your work?
YouTube.com/something/folding ideas. Let me double check what the actual, like, I have that custom, you know, the custom channel name, and I'm trying to remember what it is. YouTube.com/C/folding ideas, or Twitter @foldablehuman.
Well, thank you so much for coming on the show. It was awesome having you on. Thank you for suggesting Final Fantasy IX.
It was a great time.
Yeah, and you're welcome to come back anytime. It was great having you on. And that about wraps it up for episode 57 of The Best Games Period. You can find us on iTunes. We'd always appreciate a little review or subscribe on there. You can also find us on SoundCloud. Now we have a Facebook page at facebook.com/bestgamesperiod. And you can also find our Patreon if you feel like, you know, sending a buck our way. Over at patreon.com/bestgamesperiod, and also on Twitter. Guess what the handle is? It's Best Games Period. Shock and awe. Baby, with that, I'm gonna just say, usually there's someone to ask me questions, like we wrap it up that way, but it's just, I'm just gonna say, Extra Life. We tend to talk about that at the end of every episode, and I tend to talk about it, so here's me talking about it. Extra Life is basically an amazing charity where people can play games and raise money to help sick and injured kids in Children's Miracle Network hospitals all across the United States and Canada. And each year, people get together, and instead of doing a walkathon or a marathon, they play games. They get together with friends, family, strangers around their communities, and raise money. It's really, really great. And each person who signs up can choose which Children's Miracle Network hospital they want their money to go to, and 100% of all money they raise goes directly to that hospital. So you know where your money is going, and it's going directly to kids who need it. So you can find out more about that over on extra-life.org. And you can also find this very podcast on the community side of things on community.extra-life.org. Please check it out. wonderful charity, and it actually does help kids quite a bit. So, with that, thank you for listening, and we'll see you on the flippity dippity.
Come back.